Good morning. Today is Tuesday, the 14th of Sivan. Mark, is that correct? I believe it is the 14th of Sivan. And
they must be the 14th.
I believe so. And it is the 25th of May. And we are studying the entire Talmud. Presently, we are in the Tractate of Shabbos, chapter 5, talking about animal gear and what kind of gear, harness, and the like would be considered superfluous, unnecessary, and therefore a burden, and which parts of their gear are essential and therefore permitted to wear on Shabbos. Now we're gonna continue the Gemara, but at the last 15 minutes or 20 minutes of the Gemara share, I'm gonna break my word of yesterday, and I want to share with you 3 pages from the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa that gives an overview of animal care. There's not a lot of discussion about our big issue, but I thought that might be a good way to comprehensively give us some halachic facts as determined in the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, so we're not left with this constant mystery. So the Gemara will continue to fill us in, but I thought that might be a wise thing, so stand by. We are presently studying Nun Beis Amud Aleph, turning the page to Nun Beis Amud Beis. That is 52B, no, 52A and 52B. And I just got a text message that this fine young man in our community had a bond set at $11,000, and he has a GPS monitor, and he has to stay away from the show that he was harassing. So we'll keep an eye out, but I have a feeling, I hope he feels disincentivized to continue his reign of terror. Here we go, let's share the screen. I'm gonna hit mute all just for some background noise concerns. As always, I hope you'll unmute so we can hear your wonderful voices, but importantly, thoughts and ideas. So this was yesterday's Gemara. Here we go. Also, Ravdimi, if you may recall, we were talking about the difference between having a chain around an animal's neck for the purpose of securing them and holding them, or having a chain that's just wrapped around their neck as if for decoration, but not for any actual securing of the animal. And we had 2 opinions if that is acceptable or not. We're now going to review some anecdotal evidence or anecdotes that might inform our discussion, and particularly an anecdote about Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi Rebbe is considered persuasive in the Gemara. And as you may have noticed, we've already encountered a number of anecdotes from different students of Rebbe in an attempt to establish the halacha or halachic practice. Again, we give a lot of weight to Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi as well as to others. So let's see. Ki asa Rav Dimi. When Rav Dimi arrived from, where did he arrive from? He arrived from Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, everyone's muted, so please a reminder to unmute as long as there's no background.
It would arrive from Babylon.
Well, to Babylon, from Eretz Yisrael. Rav Dimi was one of the one of the travelers. He would travel back and forth, but he's bringing regards from Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi, who was a resident of Eretz Yisrael. He also Rav Dimi Amar Rav Chanina. When Rav Dimi came, he quoted the name of Rabbi Chanina, saying as follows: Mula'ot. This is a strange word to me. Anyways, Mula'ot says Rashi, Pradot, mules. So I don't know if the word mule is developed from the word Mula'ot, but I will tell you that Mula'ot and mules sound quite similar. Mula'ot, and I don't recall seeing this word frequently in the Hebrew language. Anybody here recognize this word?
See it every day.
Mula'ot shel Beit Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's mules.
That's the mullah. Mullahs from Iran.
Mullahs, yes.
And he's also a donkey.
Or some variation of that.
Right.
Mula'ot shel Beit Rabbi Yotzot ba'afsarei and b'shabbat. He would allow them to go around with their bit and the full gear on Shabbos. Now the question is, okay, Ibayiluhu, here's our question. Keruchim, Ainim Shachim. Is it wrapped around the neck without much function, and then maybe it would be there lenoi for decoration, for beauty, or were they actively being deployed to secure these mulaot, these mules? Were they wrapped around the neck, or were they deployed? Were they in use? And of course, depending on what we will determine was the design, the nature of those chains, leashes, whatever, reins, well, that's going to be that's going to have an important halachic implication. Are you allowed to let your animals run wild even if with their reins if they're not in use? And again, I'll remind you to conjure up the images that we saw yesterday at the L'chaim Farms in Dania Beach. We can visualize some of what we're discussing. So the Gemara now wants to resolve this matter so that we can ascertain the halachic implications. Tashema. So we'll have a resolution to this by quoting a companion text that provides more information. Here is another way this tradition was preserved. Also, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, when Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came from Israel to Bavel, he's quoted the same Rabbi Chanina. Is that right? Yes, the same Rabbi Chanina. And he said the line almost identical, but not. Mula ot shel Beit Rebbe, the mules of the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the prince. Yoitzois be'afserehen, they would go out with the bit and all the associated gear, including the reins. Keruchim ba'Shabbat, that were wrapped around the neck but not in use on Shabbos. And we can therefore infer from this added line, Keruchim b'Shabbos, that according to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the Yehuda the prince, the great halachic authority, codifier of the Mishnah, Nasi, according to him, it would be entirely acceptable to allow your animal to go around with their reins wrapped around their neck. And therefore, clearly, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, did not consider this to be a masoi, a burden, and therefore it would be acceptable on Shabbos, which is big news for our sugya. So interesting, we have two teachings. One brought to us by Rav Dimi, one brought to us by Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, both essentially saying the same thing. However, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda, with the added necessary detail, necessary information to fill in our blanks. Excuse me. Amruha Rabbanan Kamed Ravasi. So now the rabbis are going to start to parse and analyze these two teachings, the almost identical teachings. So the Chachamim said in the presence before Ravasi, I guess to probe and to see if you would agree. Did Shmuel Bar Yehuda loy tzricha? Shocking words. You know, we just said that there was two texts, and the first text was vague and ambiguous, and we didn't know the halacha, and the second text was enlightening and essential for us to know what exactly Rabbi Yehuda Rebbe allowed. And therefore, in our minds, the second text is absolutely essential. Well, the Chachamim are going to make the claim now in the presence of Ravasi that we don't need that second text. The first text would have been sufficient. As we know, Talmudic thought process encourages analysis, interpretation, extrapolation, and inference. And the Chacham are going to explain that we could have inferred from that statement what he was talking about. So let's see what he tried to say. Amruha Rabbanan Kamed Ravasi, Hadar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda lo tzricha. This added statement of Shmuel Bar Yehuda, who told us that the reins were wrapped around the neck, not in function, but for design. We could have inferred that mid Rav Dimi Nafka. We could have inferred it from the first teaching, which did not specify. How so? Did Rav Dimi nimshachim ka'amar? Because if Rav Dimi only wanted to tell us that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi allowed his mules to have their reins on when they were being secured and schlepped around, well then that's not a chiddush. We know it already. Mid Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel Nafka. This is already known to us. So the fact that Rabbi Dimi was coming to add to the conversation, say, you know what, I saw Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and you saw how he had his mules, and the fact that he was coming to add this to a conversation that was already quite familiar with the fact that you're allowed to use a rein when it's to secure the animal, we could infer that he was teaching a chiddush, that it was kruchim. Let's see Rashi. Again, Rashi is repeating the words of the Gemara with his interpretation. If you think the Rav Dimi says that the rein is only permissible when it's being schlepped, but he would not allow it to be wrapped around the neck. And all he was coming to teach us is that you're allowed to secure a mule with a bit, and the bit, when used, is not considered a burden. Well, that we know already. So again, just to recap, two traditions from Rebbe via Rabbi Chanina, one with the added information. To us, it was obvious that we need both texts, but the Gemara says no. We could have inferred from Rabbi Dimi's teaching that it was talking about it was wrapped around the neck. So let's see how the Gemara continues. What was the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel that would tell us that you're allowed to have a bit on an animal's neck when it's being used? They wanted to know, what if you'll mix around the securing harnesses of the different animals? Amar Lefanav Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi said in the presence of they said it before Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. Kach Amar Abba. This is what Rabbi Yossi taught. Arba behemos yoisais be'avsar hasus ve'apered ve'agamal ve'chamor. So Rabbi Yossi, remember Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi were contemporaries of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and typically we know he respected their opinions, and they taught that a pered, which is a mulaot in another word, can have an afsar, can have a bit, and attached to that bit is a rein. So we already know from here that when the bit and the reins are being used to secure the animal, it is permitted to be on the animal on Shabbos. And we assume that everybody knows this and agrees with this. So Rav Dimi coming to teach us a new teaching, obviously he's teaching even when it is loose, not tight, and not secured, you can keep it on your mule. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz's recap. Apparently, according to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, a mule may go out on Shabbos pulled by its bit, and the only question is if it's not being pulled. Again, the rabbi said to the presence of Rav Asi, wise comment, Rav Dimi taught us everything we need to know, and we could read deeply into his words, and we'll know that he's talking about even a loosely wrapped rein. Rav Asi will have none of it. Amalu Rav Asi responded to his students' clever comment about being able to infer from Rav Dimi how Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had his mules secured or wrapped around. We need both teachings. Why the Rabbi Yehuda Nafka? What we just read that Rabbi Yehuda says, that a mule is permitted to have a bit on Shabbos. Havamina, it is possible that Omar Lefanav, this statement was said in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but he may have rejected the teaching. So just because something is said in the presence of another person, that does not mean that it was accepted as halacha. So let's go back over here just to show you what happened. The following conversation happened in the presence of Rabbi. And Rabbi Yishmael asserted that Rabbi Yossi permitted a mule to have a bit. I and you assumed initially that don't we know that Rabbi always accepts the teachings of Rabbi Yossi, as we read earlier? Well, Rav Asi says no, not necessarily. Rabbi doesn't always accept his word as, I can't say the gospel, but as Torah Missinai, as the fact, as the halacha. And therefore, simply having a statement made in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is not compelling. But then Rabbi Dimi comes and teaches us that Rebbe actually accepted that a mule can have a bit on Shabbos. And then the other Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda came and said they can even be slack, they can even be loose, and it's still not considered carrying.
I have a problem with that reasoning.
Okay, go ahead.
Because we have many times when we say that he was in the presence of and he said it, we take it automatically that they agreed. Many times.
Not always, though. Not always. I know what you're referring to
I
is.
see now, not always.
What you're referring to is a principle called shtika kehoda. If the person has a statement made in their presence and they're silent, usually we'll say shtika kehoda. If Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was silent, then that's usually consent, agreeing. But apparently not always, and apparently the way this tradition is presented to us, it doesn't explicitly reference that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was silent. It just said the following conversation happened in front of him. And we don't think he said anything, but we don't know that he was silent. And I suppose for that reason, although you're asking a good question, why don't we say a comment made in his presence is compelling? But Rav Asi says, I'm not convinced. This text at least is not conclusive that just because it was said in his presence, that is halacha. At the very least, it is helpful, it's advantageous to have an additional teaching from Rav Dimi to reiterate and confirm that indeed Rabbi Yehuda Nasi allowed his mules to go around with a bit. Well, good question, good point. I'm glad you brought it up. Let me see if our commenters here say anything. Hold on. Here. I'll tell you why, Roberto. You asked a good question. I don't see an answer, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking as I read this again. When would we say shtika kehoda? When I make a statement of fact, halachic fact, and then I don't say anything. But here, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't need to say anything, because what was being presented was not the halacha. What was being presented was a quote in the name of his father. You cannot disagree that is what his father said. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's silence is acceptance that Rabbi Yossi said that halacha. But that does not mean that it is acceptance that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi accepts that as his psak halacha. Again, if we're sitting around the table saying, hey, what should we do on Shabbos? And someone says, oh, you could put a bit in your meal, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi doesn't say anything, then we know he consented, he agreed. Shtika kehoda. But here, the shtika was only acceptance that the quote was conveyed accurately, but not that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi agreed. Again, this is my own conjecture, but I think that makes sense. Dr. Hammer, you were going to say something?
Yeah, it's a dangerous concept. I'm very familiar with the concept, but if you think to what's going on with anti-Semitism, it might be logical to infer when somebody is quiet, somebody's saying something anti-Semitic, and the people around him don't say anything, that they're in agreement. But we know that there are many reasons there, but also even in these halachic issues where people have their own reasons for not being willing to speak up if they're in disagreement. So it's a pretty slippery slope when you start, and I'm using the concept of silence. It can be taken as agreement with the previous statement in any situation. Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think silence equaling consent in halachic, intellectual consent, is narrow. And today they say that silence is violence. Have you heard that?
Silence is silence?
Silence is violence, but that's not usually said
They used to say silence is golden when I was at school.
Right. No, today they say silence is violence, but that's never deployed in favor of Israel or Jews. That's usually deployed to intimidate people from, not towing a certain. And then in today's world also, in human interactions, silence does not equal consent to different, situations. And so there certainly has to be a strong limiting principle to the idea of silence, shtika kehoda. However, under certain scenarios, when two people are having a pure intellectual conversation, there are certain times in such a one-on-one conversation that one can infer, or at least the Talmud is comfortable inferring that the person may agree. However, there are many restrictions, many limitations, and I think our Gemara is a good example of one of the situations where we will not infer shtika kehoda, and therefore we need this additional text. Again, haven't seen it anywhere, so I'm willing to be corrected, but it rings true to my impression.
There's one case where, you know, if the wife makes a vow and the husband hears about it, doesn't say anything, then that's considered as acceptance of it.
Right. So let's say so there are different reasons why silence could be agreeing. If we're by the buffet and I tell my wife, honey, you want I'm going to give you some of this, and she just doesn't say anything. Maybe she's like, okay, yeah, go ahead. But with matters of greater importance, you might want to double check. But again, I think it's primarily, you're right, that's actually a very good example. In a scenario of oaths, where in halacha, a woman is allowed to make an oath and a husband has the ability to undo the oath. The reason why the husband has the ability to undo the oath is because a couple is a unit, and therefore sometimes what one couple decides could affect the other half of the couple or the totality of the couple. Therefore, if the husband is the one that's going to be affected, and he's silent, so yeah, if he's silent, obviously he agrees to it, because otherwise he had the ability to protest or to undo it. But again, I think that makes the point that there are limiting factors and there are limited scenarios and many conditions to when we would say shtika kehoda.
That decided before the advent of credit cards, Rabbi? I don't know.
I'm sorry, I missed that, Doctor. What did you say about credit cards?
Was that decided before the advent of credit cards in terms of the wife, the husband? Okay.
Professor?
In halachic discussion, agreement doesn't necessarily mean that this is a halacha. That is, if Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi didn't say anything, it still doesn't mean that this could be or should be accepted as a halacha. And indeed, there is very little to argue about. The subject here is the quotation of the father of
right.
So this is what he said.
There's nothing to argue. There's nothing to argue about a quotation. If someone was there and I wasn't there, I can't say that's not what he said. Right. So his silence is not consenting to the halachic fact. He's just agreeing that the statement was as presented. Yes. Shkaya. Professor, anything else on the subject of silence equaling agreement?
It's endless subject.
Okay.
And as Dr. Hammer said, there are in many situations, it's the number of factors is so huge that we cannot really judge it in a straight way. But here in the halachic discussion, I think this is much simpler.
Right. So socially, in a social question, there are so many reasons why a person may or may not choose to speak up in the moment that does not equal agreeing. And but the professor, so you're saying in a halachic or a Talmudic conversation where there are certain rules to the game. They were known, when you're arguing within a system, the system has certain principles and certain,
sometimes silence is due to pressure on the person. They have a whole other area.
By the way, I don't want to get into it now, but the Mishnah actually, in the Mishnah, the story of that we've discussed many times of how Rabbi Gamliel is disbarred, at least temporarily. Part of it had to do with the fact that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanani, if I recall correctly, took a certain position, not knowing that would be in contradiction with the Nasis. And then when they were discussing it and he understood that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanani disagreed, he compelled him he asked if anyone disagrees and he was silent. And then he picked on him directly. And they said, listen, I was trying to be silent. I was trying to get out of this complex social dynamic, but now that you're asking me to my face, I'm going to tell you what I said. And so there are many reasons, even within the Mishnaic society, where one might disagree but not want to bring it up for whatever the reasons. Anyways, okay, so that's an interesting, Beryl, you brought up a very interesting and important question, and I think it gave us a little more clarity as to what that comment did and didn't bring to the table. So again, just to recap. And I think, hold on one second. I think this is a call from the city of Hollywood. Just give me 1 second. Hello?
Earl,
Yeah.
we're going to put that
Yes,
on
it
your
is. Who is
certificate.
this, please? Sergeant Hayward, can you just give me 1 second? All right, folks, just give me a minute. I'm just going to mute myself for a minute, and then, but please don't go anywhere.
Just
You can
mute
talk
yourself.
to the New York Times, Rabbi. It's okay.
I just muted myself, but you please, and we'll come back.
Okay. Don't stay silent. Yes, Alan. What were you going to say?
That last question you asked, we'll put that on your certificate, your graduation certificate.
No, but the professor would tell you, when you think of the refuseniks in Russia, some of them stayed silent. Does that mean they didn't want to leave?
No, it's true. It's sometimes you just
No,
get
you
so
have the
fed
whole
up that you
question.
say, oh,
I think Bernie didn't want to go there. You got this whole question now of consent and rape.
yeah.
Right.
Bernie
You know,
didn't want to go there, and I don't blame him.
Right.
Sometimes you argue back and forth, and it gets you so aggravated. Oh, have it your way. That's all.
Yeah, but if you come to court and you say, look, she didn't say anything, it's not going to get you off the hook.
No.
Bernie, what's the story with the police? With the guy?
They caught him, and he's on bail for, what did they say, $1,100? $11,000, which means you put down 10% of that, so it's not a heck of a lot of money.
At least they have a GPS on him. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I guess he's got to stay away from the others. But I hope he's got to stay with them.
Wonder how they caught him.
I remember they used to have the cop car parked in the street across from the shul.
Yeah.
I wonder how they caught him.
Yeah, he lives in the sky. I don't know what it is. I don't know why only give you the fine.
Earl,
Yeah.
I like that email you sent about the Palestinians putting makeup on their faces to make them look like they were.
Yeah,
bleeding.
I got it from somebody painting their faces, that's for sure.
Oh my God.
Meanwhile, I see in Jerusalem Post today, the UN is sending 100 million in aid to Gaza. Be more
Really?
Mercedes and more mansions for the
That's right.
kleptomaniacs.
Yeah, and more tunnels. I never liked Biden. I never trusted him.
Are you kidding? Are you? This is,
Me, he's
this
like-
is a good deal for them. I mean, if you send them blankets, they sell the blankets and buy a Mercedes.
That's right.
But Americans are naive, they think they're dealing with people from Chicago and New York.
Well, they're not as bright as the Canadians, that's right, Mr. Hammer.
I am not going to remain silent, but I don't want to get into this discussion where we have our Canadian quote friend talking about our leaders or our people. I know you're far superior because of the cool weather there. You're very cool people, and I know that. So it takes a few more months for you to get your inoculations, that you have to come to the stupid country of America with our terrible leaders who enable the fact is, I understand that. It's a difficult. So I don't want to stay silent, but we get to learn Gemara together. We're not here.
Bernie, that's like the story with the shotgun, and when they ask about the guy, he said, I don't want to say, but people say he does this, and then I heard, but don't believe it. Don't let it bother you.
All right, folks. We're back.
They didn't arrest you?
They didn't arrest me. I convinced them that there might be other alternative options. But the city of Hollywood is taking this was a sergeant calling to follow up, and they're going to be trying to provide additional how do you call it? Additional security and officers, particularly on the weekends. And so they're taking the situation, seriously, thank God. And, I guess time will tell how serious and how much they're willing to do, but it's clear to me that they'd like this problem to go away. And I'm happy for that. That's good. That's a good start. So thank you for your patience, and we can continue. And we're actually going to close out this subject. So just to recap, we read this before, but Ravasi said, listen, we need all these texts. The initial text that says that a mule can have a bit, that might have been a statement relayed in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but he didn't necessarily accept that as halachic fact. He probably did accept that it was a fact that it was said, but not that he embraced the halachic implications. Rabbi added something, but I wouldn't know for sure if it was only when it was in active use, when it was being pulled, or maybe even loose. And therefore, the third text, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, teaches us that even when it was wrapped around the neck, in more of a decorative manner, it would remain permissible, according to Rav Yehuda Hanas. We're now going to go to the next part of the Mishnah. As you may recall, the Mishnah mentions that animals like horses and other animals that have chains around their neck may have a chain around the neck on Shabbos. And then the Mishnah added another detail, which was not essential to the conversation of Shabbos, but was added parenthetically, and that was that if the chain was impure, ritually impure, its purification can be done by sprinkling the purifying waters on it. And we also might recall, we talked about dunking the animal in the mikvah alongside its chain, assuming there was an animal-sized mikvah. And again, in those days, the bodies of water that were used were probably more animal-friendly than our modern-day spa-like mikvahs, which I am fairly certain have no animal policies. Probably support animals may be an exception, but you cannot.
The other people in the mikvah might be upset if there's a donkey with them.
Yeah, if a donkey came into the mikvah and someone was there, they may be slightly alarmed. Unless the donkey started talking prophetic stuff, and then you'll say, "Oh, that's Bilam's donkey." Okay, we'll let him in. But otherwise,
Bilam.
One ass in the mikveh is enough.
I give out. So the Mishnah states, "Umazin alehem v'toiv lebim kaiman." You're allowed to sprinkle onto the animal and the chain that's attached to the animal, and you're also allowed to have the animal toivel. Lememra the b'nei kabuli tumaninu. Are you trying to say that these chains are capable of becoming ritually impure? You may not know this, but we've discussed a good bit about laws of ritual purity and impurity. And while it's going to be very hard to remember all the details, what I'm sure you do recall is that it's complicated. And not everything can become impure. There are criteria. And some of those criteria would seem to point to this chain around the animal's neck, or the ring around the animal's neck that attaches to the chain, or the series of rings that comprise this chain should not be able to become impure. So we're now going to quote a Mishnah, the Tzvihat Tanan. We've learned in a Mishnah. Where is this Mishnah? I'll tell you in a second. This Mishnah is in the tractate of Kalim. And in the tractate Kalim it says, Tabas Adam, a ring for a person's ring that he wears, Tameya, can become ritually impure. Rashi, Tabas Adam. What is a Tabas Adam? A human ring. A kind of ring that a person would put on their finger for decoration. So a human being wears a ring. That ring is susceptible to become ritually impure. V'tabas behema v'kelim.
Not to wear.
Sorry, Beryl, you're breaking up. Beryl, is it you or me? I think we lost.
Bad tradition is for men not to wear a ring.
May or may not be, but certainly in the time of the Gemara, it wasn't impossible that a human being should wear a ring. It doesn't specify male or female. You're saying the word tabas adam makes it sound like it's a man ring as opposed to a woman ring. But here, I actually think I translated it correctly.
I know Chabad custom is not to wear a ring.
The Chabad custom generally, I'm not sure if there's a stated custom, but generally Chabadniks don't tend to wear rings, but there are exceptions. I've seen Chabadniks wearing rings. But yeah, if you had to generalize, I would say the Chabad custom is not to wear, men not to wear rings. But that's not really relevant.
I tried to get my wife to accept that custom, couldn't get there.
But that's not really entirely relevant to our Gemara, even though I know what you're getting at. The word tabas adam sounds like a man ring, but it's really a human ring, a person ring of all genders. So a human ring can become impure. V'tabas behema v'kelim. However, a ring that is to serve animals or vessels, ushar kol tabaot, and all other kinds of rings, Tihorot, they remain ritually pure, meaning they cannot become impure. Let's read Rashi. Tveya, why does a human ring become impure? The tachshidhu, it is a decorative piece of jewelry. Umimidyan yalfinan, and in the story of the battle of the Jewish people against Midian, where they brought back a whole bunch of stuff, yalfinan dimana behen, among the booty, among the loot, the spoils, it lists tachshitin, atzadav etzamid, it lists different kinds of human adornments, finger nose rings, other kinds of rings, finger rings. And the verse says that you got to purify them. Now, what would be an animal ring? Kigoin shear. For example, I guess the way you attach a chain is by a series of rings, and there's a ring that attaches to the neck, and that should not be able to become ritually impure. Tabas kelim, for example, sometimes you want to carry a vessel or the pot cover, and you'll have a ring on it or something. Ushar kol tabais, or for example, if you have a cabinet that has a ring so you can open it, those are all rings that cannot become impure. The halachot, the Jewish laws of when a metal vessel can become impure, there are some criteria. Sure, who's coming to the door? Oh. Good morning. Good morning. All right, so there you have it. How would you ever have a scenario that an animal ring would become impure or an animal chain would become impure? It's not a tachshit. It's not jewelry in the context that halachically would allow it to become impure. So the Gemara answers an interesting answer. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha explains, we're talking about a ring or a chain, which although presently is affixed on an animal, it originally may have been a human person adornment. And by virtue of that earlier function, and during its earlier function, it may have become impure. Let's read Rashi. For example, this chain was originally supporting your bling. And while you had your nice chain with whatever was on it, it became impure. And after it became ritually impure, you gave your chain to your animal. It needs to become ritually purified from its present and pre-existing impurity. And until then, you cannot allow that chain to come in contact with items that must remain pure. So, how do you have animal jewelry, an animal chain, an animal ring that becomes ritually impure? It shouldn't happen. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha answers it's only impure because it used to function as a human jewelry, and that's when it became impure. But Rabbi Yitzchak has an alternative explanation, which you may or may not like better than the earlier answer. Being that the chain is used for the human to pull their animal, who really is served by this chain? The animal or the person? It's like the person that says he loves fish and he eats the fish. You don't love fish. You like eating fish. You love yourself. So when you have a chain on your animal, does your animal want the chain? No, your animal's quite not interested. It's very much not interested in that chain. The human wants the chain because it is for the human to maintain, to secure, to keep their grasp on the animal. Rashi chashiv leikli tashmish adam. So Rav Yosef says this is really a human. It's a chain for a human, to benefit a human. I think it's a very interesting thing to consider. I think that's maybe deep is an overstatement, but I think it's a thought-provoking comment.
Yeah.
So there you have it. Milay Tanya, weren't we taught? Makel shel behema, shel mateches mekavel tuma. Didn't we learn that an animal prod made out of metal can become ritually impure? Matam, Rav Yosef says, why would it become impure? Hayil va'adam roida bahem, because a human being uses it to control and to guide their animals, but it's ultimately the person's tool to make his life easy, make the animal's life more miserable. So similarly, a chain that's on the neck of an animal, but the purpose is to control the animal, that would be entirely for the interest of the human being and very much not in the interest of the animal. Rashi, it's used to hit and to control and to guide the camel or the donkey, or maybe you use it in a circus for a bear. But regardless, it is a person tool, a person toy. And Rashi says it's important to note that it has to be made out of metal. If it was made out of wood, such an item would never become ritually impure because it's a simple and doesn't hold anything. Give me a few minutes if you don't mind. Hello? No, I don't mind. Okay, thank you. Mike, Tom?
Rabbi,
Yes.
I was wondering what would happen, if somebody put a ring around the horse's neck,
Okay.
right? And he used that to pull the horse.
Okay.
Or just to lead the horse. What if he touched a corpse? Or what if he went to the bathroom and didn't wash his hands and then touched the ring? Wouldn't that make it impure?
Complicated question, but based on what our Gemara said, no. It's not susceptible to impurity if it's a tool for animal. If it's there for animals, the default assumption is no, it cannot become impure. We've now come up with some exceptions where the human being, I hear what you're asking. You're asking according to Rav Yosef, who says that ultimately any tool that's securing an animal is a human tool, but putting that aside, the default reading of this Gemara would indicate that it would not become ritually impure. But you're asking a good question.
Rabbi, is any of this any concern to us in
2021? Well, being that we don't observe the laws of ritual impurity,
exactly.
Purity, so most of the aspects of ritual impurity do not relate to us, certainly not immediately. However, first of all, it's Torah. And when we study the aspects of Torah that we can't presently observe, we get the credit for that part of the Torah. So that's one reason why we study it. And second of all, the Torah ultimately...
Even at the time of the Mishnah, it's the same situation.
In the
They're
time of
talking
the-
about this.
in the
Very
ti-
interesting.
You may be surprised to hear this, but in the time of the Mishnah, even though the temple was destroyed, I believe they did observe laws of ritual purity, certainly in Eretz Yisrael. So it was relevant then.
You don't have the paraduma ashes anymore, though.
Okay, so the specifics we might not have, but the ability for it to become impure and the methods that it can become pure. But again, also Jews believe that we'll rebuild the Beis Hamikdash b'meheira of Yameinu, and we're going to have to know these laws. And all of us here will have a head start on everybody else because we learned it. You know, the Chafetz Chaim had a
They're preparing for.
the Chafetz Chaim had a special.
They're preparing for when we build the Beis Hamikdash again.
Absolutely.
To know.
Absolutely.
I'm very interested in these laws because in my household we have a dove and a tzvi, so we have to be cognizant of.
So you see, Rashi threw in that dove very casually, but now we know why. So yeah, but they're not immediate. These aren't immediately applicable in their essential state. In other words, the other reason why it's valuable is because we learn. Every Mishnah teaches us facts that ultimately can be valuable for other aspects of halacha. But reading the text that says, hey, a ring around an animal's neck can become ritually impure, can become purified, that's not something that we practice in the present day.
I don't want to go off track, but if we have to deal with a question of whether a thing is kosher or not, would we look at some of these things to give us guidance?
Kosher as in for food? Probably not. The laws of kosher is not what I had. The laws of kosher.
Utensil, whatever.
So it's not really the laws of kosher that I had in mind, but there are other laws, including, are there places that you're not allowed to go when you're ritually impure? Well, could you have an animal go there? Could they, if it has a certain adornment, would that be impure? Or let's say there are certain foods that are somehow considered truma. If you could find a hypothetical where food could have the sanctity of truma, well then you'd have to be super careful with it. So there are more obscure, or when it comes to the definition or to the conceptualization of what these tools are and how they work. So anyways, I'm going to leave you with a question here. The Mishnah says you can table the animal while it's wearing its ring. The Gemara here asks an important question. We're going to end right here. Surely you realize that there is a chatzitza. There is something between the item and the water. What creates the chatzitza? Rashi. Shetabasa kavua b'shir. There is a ring that's attached to the chain. Kavua b'yv'choizik. It's very tightly affixed. The einamayim nechnasin. Sham and water cannot flow through it. Rabbi Steinzel says the same thing in English. The rings of the chain are firmly attached to the chain. There's no room for the water of the ritual bath to completely surround the chain. So how could you tovel it? For the further analysis of the question and the answer, we're going to have to see the Gemara tomorrow. And although we don't always study Tosfos, this Tosfos will be informative as well. But for now, I want to thank you all for joining us today for another journey through the Talmud. And we didn't say the dedication in the beginning, but let's mention David ben Sultana Malka. And let's also mention Daniel. Hang on, let me see if I can find the text. Jonathan Chaim ben Victoria, and Yosef ben Flora, and all those that need a Yeshua in different ways. Hashem should bless them in a prayer for continued calm and peace in the land of Israel. And we wish Dr. Hammer a mazel tov for the upcoming wedding of your great nephew, right?
Right.
Should be b'shat tova mitzlachas, and there should only be simchas for your family and for all of Klal Yisrael, and particularly in Eretz HaKodesh.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Amen.
Thank you, Rab. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shkoyachal, thank you for being here, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Be'ezrat Hashem.
I'll see you Thursday. I can't make it tomorrow, unfortunately, so I'll see you Thursday.
All right, we'll see you then. Thank you.
Okay.